Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football, from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Hello, thank you for tuning into the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Nick Bowles. We got a lot to talk about today. Got a lot of transfers and commitments going on in the world of college football. Also going to talk about some coaching changes as well. And what I did with the ACC last podcast, I want to do with the Big 12 this podcast, and sort of looking at the more notable teams and how I think their schedule looks for them next year. But first, I think we'll start with one of the bigger headlines, and that is Ed Orgerons signing a 6-year, $42 million deal at LSU. Of course, he is obviously well deserving of it, given the 15-0 undefeated record that they had last year. The historic way they beat 7 teams ranked in the top 10 at the time the game was played, which is the first time that that's happened in the history of college football. And obviously him winning the national championship and putting that cherry on top. We sort of all figured that this was coming. Overall, it's a base annual salary of $6 million. He will receive a $5 million split dollar life insurance policy that's payable over the first 2 years. So in all, it brings the deal to $42 million, and that's before bonuses. So he could probably earn even more if he continues to win, probably winning some bowl games, things of this nature. And really what this reminds me of, or what I've always thought to be true, if you can become a household name in college football and you can essentially become the quote-unquote big man on campus in terms of being a head football coach in college football, I think that it's almost becoming more preferable than becoming an NFL head coach. And the reasons why I think this, or the way I see it, is it seems that overall in college football there are much fewer variables to deal with in terms of egos, players' personalities, media, TV contracts, local media and TV, the overall politics of players. Perhaps your owner has a big personality and likes to take control of things more than you would like as a head football coach at the NFL level. And all these things, when you kind of add them up, can really sort of distract you from the game, and it becomes a lot less about football. It becomes a lot more about managing your time, trying to watch what you say, making sure you're putting on a certain face for this person or that person. And I feel like in college football, if you can sort of reach the status of Ed Orgeron, Nick Saban, Dabo Swinney, or even just becoming a kind of Mac Brown when he was at Texas, I honestly feel for those coaches that are in that position. Now, the pressure will always be there, and there will always be kids that you have to deal with in terms of egos, and of course there's TV and things like that too. But the position that these type of coaches are in, I feel that they are getting the same amount of big money contracts, and yet they have a lot more control over what is going on. Now, some people will argue that kids don't have much of a say and things of this nature, but the coach can essentially use his leverage or the ability to sit players, etc., to sort of run the ship how he wants and run a tight ship. And a good example of this is if a player in the NFL is not performing well, or he's acting up and he's not doing anything that's way out of line, he's just sort of being a diva, he can always start to blame other people, and then the media will go crazy wanting to know or wanting to ask the coach what is going on. Who is the blame on? How did this start? And I feel like in the college game, a college coach can just sit a player, and that's kind of the end of the story. Or he can make him sit out for a game. He can cut him. Whatever the issue may be, someone like an Ed Orgeron or Nick Saban is just going to do whatever they want to a player. And there's not really a lot of second guessing. I mean, sure, people will want to know, but it's not going to go very far. And I feel like in the NFL, it turns into more of a drama than just sort of trying to run your ship as best as possible as a football coach. And also a great example of this was the Nick Saban experiment when he went to the pros for a while there in Miami. And come to find out, he had originally wanted to draft Drew Brees, I believe, but instead they took Dante Culpepper because of outside pressure. Where at Alabama, let's just say if he had the sort of control that he had there, he just would have drafted Drew Brees and that would have been it. There's no need to get approval or a second opinion from anyone. Nick Saban would simply just call the shot. And if a player wasn't doing well, then he would sit him or bench him, maybe try something out of the box with him. And in the college game, that's just accepted, or the player would say yes, sir, and do it, more than likely. And in the pros, you might have a guy tweeting about it, saying how Nick Saban doesn't know anything, sort of trying to blow it up into being more than just trying to play football and letting the coach do his job. This Ed Orgeron deal, first of all, very good for him. Glad to see him get the money he deserves. He's been through a lot. He's been in the coaching carousel for a while. He's even gone unpaid, I believe, for a while when he was an assistant coach at other places. So I'm very happy to see him get the money, sort of have the breakthrough that he had, and all the accolades he received this past year. But I think essentially, unless the bottom just completely falls out for Ed Orgeron, I really don't see him ever going anywhere else or even being tempted by going to the pros. Why would you want to leave somewhere where you've essentially built the foundation, you get to call the shots, you're essentially loved by everyone in the state of Louisiana? People go there knowing that you're in charge and that you are going to tell them what to do and how to do it in terms of players. And obviously the athletic director is not going to get in your way or try to be another cook in the kitchen. He's going to let you run your football program like you want to run it. And unless you do something so questionably bad that you get fired or you cast a bad light on the university or something really extreme, I don't see him going anywhere until he's ready to leave. Because obviously LSU is going to continue to recruit well. I think Orgeron's going to continue to win. Now obviously they have to get past Bama every year, but again, there's no shame in losing to Bama as long as you're doing everything else you should be doing. And obviously he's got to win a few of those games here and there. That's kind of why Les Miles was let go. It just sort of felt like it was becoming stale and they couldn't get over the hump. But it seems like Ed Orgeron has that mentality that he expects to beat Alabama every year. And it's not about trying to pull off a trick play or something of this nature. He's going to try and beat you straight up. He's going to give Saban fits for years to come. And I think he's going to be constantly hearing footsteps behind him, which will be Ed Orgeron's footsteps. So I just wanted to touch on the sort of way that coaching has been shaping up to me these last 10 years or so. And it just seems like the college coaches are having a lot more fun. It seems like they enjoy progressing these young men into men or boys into men. And they're not having to deal with all this drama, these divas, all of the press all the time in terms of the difference between the way the press treats college game versus the way they treat the NFL. You know, in the NFL, everyone's sort of free to take a shot at since they are adults and they're getting paid a lot of money. So essentially the media can sort of say anything they want and criticize anyone they want. And all is fair in love and war, and I understand that. Obviously in the college game, there's a little bit of a barrier there and an understanding that these are still kind of quote-unquote kids, and so people are not just going to rip them. Obviously, there was the very famous Gundy clip when he told a reporter not to talk that way about one of his players, and that these are just good kids and that they're just playing football. And college coaches are understanding that, and I think they are enjoying coaching. And I think with the NFL, you sort of have to take everything that comes with it. And for some people, and obviously a lot of people, that's just not the best gig. It's just sort of drags on you after a while and makes it become so much like a job instead of doing something you forgot you were doing because you love to do it. So since that was sort of the biggest news of the last few days, I just wanted to touch on it and give my thoughts on college coaching overall. When we come back, we'll talk about the most recent transfers going on, some of the surprise commits that have happened over the last few days. And so when we come back, I'll get into that a little more, so stay tuned and I'll be right back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alright, welcome back. Last segment I touched on Ed Orgerons' new extension that he signed with the LSU and my overall sentiment on the difference between coaching in the NFL and college and why I think me personally I would probably prefer to be a big name in college than to perhaps have to jump through all the hoops that comes with being an NFL coach. I know I said we would talk about some of the latest transfer news, and we will, but I thought we'd quickly go over some of the latest coaching changes that have happened as well. One of them is one that I touched on in a previous podcast with Todd Orlando. Todd Orlando was an assistant coach under Tom Herman at Texas, and Texas has recently undergone quite an exodus of coaching as they're trying to revamp their staff and perhaps get in a fresh look or a fresh feel in terms of their game plan. So Todd Orlando went over to Texas Tech when he was let go the last month or so, and he is already going to go ahead and bounce over to USC and become their defensive coordinator. And in terms of going from Texas to USC, he's taken a sidestep, probably most would see it that way, depending on how you look at it. Maybe a slight step down, only because USC seems to be struggling as of late. But I think going from a defensive coordinator at Texas to defensive coordinator at USC is not that big of a loss or a gain. So that's probably the more notable of the coaching changes. And while Todd Orlando perhaps is the most noticeable name to make a move, the most interesting coaching news came out of Oklahoma with DeMarco Murray becoming their new running backs coach. I think overall this probably is a good move. I think it would probably help with recruiting in some kind of facet. Players who want to go, who are big running backs, knowing that DeMarco Murray will be their coach, definitely couldn't hurt. And obviously DeMarco Murray is one of, if not the best running back to come out of Oklahoma. He had a pretty good NFL career as well, and he led the league in rushing in 2014. So obviously he knows what it takes. And more notably, he also went through a lot of injuries while he was in Oklahoma that he came back from to end up having a great career, which I think is also a little bit of experience added that can go a long way, especially for such a physically demanding job that is being a running back in football. For someone to have gone through all of that and come out the other side on top, I think will provide a lot of insight as far as what it takes to be good at the position. The next news in terms of coaching comes from Texas A&M, where they have actually hired two assistants. The first one being a linebacker coach, Tyler Santucci, who is coming over from Wake Forest. They are also bringing along TJ Rushing as a defensive backs coach, who technically is from Memphis, but he was planning on going to Florida State but hadn't officially signed a contract yet. He was going to follow Mike Norvell over to Florida State, but then decided to make the change over to Texas A&M. So A&M has hired two defensive coaches here in the past few days that they are looking to instill in their system and perhaps give it a boost or at least a new look or a new enthusiasm that maybe had been missing previously. So Jimbo is making some moves on the defensive side as well as the player side in terms of their recruiting, which I've talked about previously. It also looks like Dave Aranda has made one of his first coaching decisions in terms of his offensive coordinator. Looks like Larry Fedora is going to be coming in. Fedora is a former head coach at North Carolina. He also spent some time at Texas as an analyst coach. And he also was part of Baylor from 1991 to 1996 as a position coach for things such as wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs. So Aranda has made his first decision in terms of who he wants to run his offense. Fedora has also served as an offensive coordinator at Middle Tennessee, Florida, and Oklahoma State, and is well known for running a high-flying spread offense. It'll be interesting to see how he does there at Baylor. Another notable coaching change will be Rocky Long returning to New Mexico as their defensive coordinator. Rocky Long has been all over the place, and he originally got his start at New Mexico, so it's only fitting that we find him back there again. On January 8th, Long stepped down as the San Diego State's head coach, which at the time the school called or labeled as a retirement. He's now back for his 6th tour of duty for the New Mexico Lobos. Long played defensive back at New Mexico from 69 to 71. He then joined the staff as a graduate assistant in 72, played professionally for a little bit in Canada, and then returned to the University of New Mexico as a position coach in 1978, where he coached the offensive backs and then switched over to the defensive backs. He then got his first head coaching gig at New Mexico in 1998, where he went 65 and 69 with 5 bowl appearances and a total of 11 seasons. And then from 2011 to 2019, he went 81 and 38 with 3 Mountain West titles and at least a share of 2 division crowns. Then we have Gerald Alexander going from California to go coach with the Miami Dolphins. Gerald Alexander spent the last 3 seasons as a defensive backs coach for California, who has been one of the better defensive teams in the Pac-12 over that time. He previously coached at Montana State, Indiana State, and Washington. Although this will not be his first time at the NFL, as Alexander previously played in the league for 5 seasons with Detroit, Jacksonville, Carolina, and now is going to be with the Dolphins. He was a second-round draft pick for Detroit in 2007. And then the last coaching news of the day is that Trey Holtz has hired his little brother Skip Holtz at Louisiana Tech as a wide receivers coach. Trey Holtz played at Texas under Mack Brown and Charlie Strong. He was the backup quarterback. He then coached for a little bit at Ohio State, where he worked as a graduate assistant for the past 3 years. He mainly worked as a running backs and tight ends coach, but will now work with the wide receivers down there in Louisiana Tech. He's going to replace Todd Fitch, who left to become an offensive coordinator at Vanderbilt. And now that we've kind of gotten the coaching news out of the way, I wanted to quickly go over the latest news in terms of transfers and the transfer portal activity. We'll start with Oregon State, who has added 3 players to their roster as of late. They got a wide receiver from Florida State, Trayshawn Harrison. They also got Trey Lowe from Washington. And now they officially have Joe Keehan, who is coming over from Air Force. It's expected all 3 of them will have to sit out the 2020 season, but that Harrison and Lowe will have 2 years of eligibility beginning in 2021, and Keehan will have 3 years of eligibility beginning in 2021. So they're going to get some good use out of these guys. They'll be playing for 2 and 3 years respectively. Harrison is coming over from Florida State, where he essentially followed Willie Taggart over to that program. He was a 4-star signee in 2018 and was ranked the number 2 player in the state of Washington. He originally was going to go to Oregon, but then decided to go to Florida State to follow Willie. In 2019, Harrison caught 27 passes for 289 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was 3rd on the Seminoles in both of those categories. Trey Lowe was a 4-star recruit for the Huskies in 2018 and was rated the number 6 player in his state. He also won the 2017 Gatorade Player of the Year in Oregon, which is a nice little award to win. Trey Lowe is also a wide receiver, so Oregon State has added a pair of nice targets for their quarterback to throw to, and they look to hopefully get a lot of production out of those guys and to give defenses fits in the future. Keehan is coming over from the Air Force as a defensive tackle. He took a red shirt his true freshman year in 2019. And as a side note, he played and attended Portland's Jesuit High School and was teammates with Lowe, so there's a little bit of a history there, and it's probably one of the factors that went into both of them doing what they did. The next transfer move comes by way of Michigan. Running back Jordan Castleberry is going to be leaving the Wolverines and going to the Maryland Terrapins. He only spent 1 semester at Michigan, and he had originally committed to West Virginia during his recruiting process out of high school. Shortly after committing to West Virginia, he decided to go and enroll in Michigan, and he did just that in July 2019. He did not play for Michigan at all while there, so he can use the 2019 season as a redshirt year and will preserve 1 year of eligibility. However, because of the NCAA transfer rules, he will have to sit out this next season, and so he will not be eligible to play for Maryland until the 2021 season. I'm up against the break, so when we come back, I have a few more players I want to get to in terms of where they've landed out of the transfer portal. So stay tuned and we'll get to that, and then we'll get into breaking down the Big 12 schedule next year. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Alright, welcome back. Last segment we talked about some coaching changes that have happened, as well as some players coming out of the transfer portal and picking schools. I have a few more players I want to get to, and then we'll get into the Big 12 schedule for next year. And I will start with Kevin Henry, who's a linebacker out of Oklahoma State, who's going to be transferring to Tulane. There are almost a dozen players out of Oklahoma State who have entered the transfer portal. So that's quite a lot of players that Oklahoma State is probably going to lose. Kevin Henry enters the portal as a graduate transfer, so he will be eligible to play immediately in 2020. It will be his final year of eligibility, and he has already been awarded a 6th season of eligibility due to being redshirted as a true freshman and missing all but one game in 2017 because of a torn ACL. He was a 3-star member when he was originally recruited in 2015, and was rated the number 25 safety in the entire country, and was the number 20 ranked player out of Louisiana overall. During his time at Oklahoma State, he played in a total of 36 games, including a dozen appearances in the last season. He started only one of those 36 games, and it was in the Liberty Bowl win over Missouri. In those 36 games, he had a total of 51 tackles, 2 for loss, 1 interception, 1 forced fumble, and 1 quarterback hit, and 1 pass defensed. So he will look to make his home now in Tulane, and we'll see what he can do in his final year of eligibility down there in Louisiana. The next player is coming out of Virginia Tech, and he's going to be going to Missouri. Damon Hazelton Jr. has now joined Missouri as a graduate transfer, so he will be able to play immediately in the 2020 season. This is the second transfer of his career. He had originally signed with Ball State out of high school, then transferred over to Virginia Tech, and is now going to be making his home in Missouri. In 2018, he led the Hokies with 51 catches for 802 yards and 8 touchdowns. His production dipped a little bit as last year he only had 31 catches for 527 yards, but still caught 8 touchdowns, which is pretty impressive considering he only had 31 total catches. He is joining a Missouri receiving group where no player caught more than 31 passes last year, so it looks like he is going to be an immediate boost to what they currently have. So I expect him to have a pretty big year next year as long as he stays healthy and everything goes as it should. He's already going to be their best receiver that they have currently, and so I look for him to put up some pretty good numbers, I would suspect. And then perhaps the biggest transfer news in terms of players in the last few days is that former 5-star recruit out of Penn State, wide receiver Justin Shorter, is going to be transferring to the University of Florida. Shorter out of high school was the number 1 receiver in the country, the number 1 player at any position out of New Jersey, and the number 8 recruit overall according to 24/7 Sports Big Board. As a true freshman, he was limited to only 4 games because of injuries. He caught 3 passes for 20 yards. In 11 games last year, he caught 12 passes for 137 yards. So unfortunately, he has not put up the numbers that some might have hoped, being that he was such a high recruit. But it looks like he is going to be going to the University of Florida, where he will have to sit out a year next year, as he's not a graduate transfer and he doesn't really have any exceptions that he can make a case for. So beginning in 2021, he will be a big boost to the Florida offense, which Florida is very well known for their defense, but their offense has been hurting as of late, even though last year they were able to sort of manufacture some offense, although I wouldn't call them a good offensive team. It looks like he will be quite a weapon to add for Florida, who is never short of athletes in all honesty, but their offense has never been that of a well-oiled machine, if you will. So those are the latest transfer notes on players, also some coaches and where they have gone. I now kind of want to get into the Big 12 schedule for next year. On my last podcast, I went over the ACC schedule, kind of touched on the top 4 or 5 teams, kind of how I saw it playing out, maybe how I thought some games could bounce one way or the other, depending on what that could mean. And since a lot of these schedules are just now being released in the past couple weeks or past month or so, it's fun to kind of go over them and see who is going to be playing who, mainly in the out-of-conference games and then perhaps some rivalry games as well. And as some of you recall, I have Texas as kind of being the front runner for the Big 12 next year, almost by default. Oklahoma will have to replace Hurts, so I see them perhaps taking a small step back. They will more than likely be replacing Hurts with Rattler, who is one of the best recruits in a long time in terms of quarterback to be coming up through Oklahoma and not a transfer. And he also has a great core of highly ranked wide receivers there in Oklahoma that he will have the chance to possibly do some big things with. But being that he is a first-year starter and sort of the first year of him taking the reins, I obviously think there will be some kind of a learning curve, especially when it comes to big games and he's not beating up on teams like Kansas. When he plays the more highly ranked defenses or the better coaches of the Big 12, I expect him to perhaps struggle in a game or two. That, coupled with the fact that Ehlinger is coming back, he is obviously the most seasoned and accomplished quarterback in the Big 12, along with Tom Herman, who is a good coach. I look for Texas' defense to be much better next year overall, so I kind of have Texas almost by default being the best team out of the Big 12 next year. I don't see a team going to the playoff out of the Big 12 next year. I see them sort of knocking each other off, each team sort of having 2 or 3 losses. Obviously, Baylor will not be as good next year. Oklahoma will not be as good next year. But I don't think Texas is going to be good enough to run the table, per se. They also have to play LSU, which will not be held against them depending on the year that LSU has. Remember, LSU is losing a lot of talent too, most notably Joe Burrows. So I look for LSU to possibly not be as good as they were this year going into next season. So that win could be big. That win could almost not be as big as they would hope if Texas is able to pull it off. So when we come back from the break, I'm going to start getting into it, look over some other teams from the Big 12, get into the actual games, where they're being played, how I think it will all break down, and who I think is going to win what. So stay tuned, and I'll be right back, and we'll go over the Big 12.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's GSMCpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
right, welcome back to the GSMC College Football Podcast. Last segment, we went over some of the notable transfers that have been going on. Small touch-up on the coaching changes as well. And as stated right before we went to break, I want to go over the Big 12 schedule this year. This will probably take up the majority of the remainder of the podcast, as I like to sort of go team by team and look into their schedules, who they're playing, and kind of where I think people are going to settle. So we'll start off with Oklahoma, as they're obviously the biggest school in the Big 12 or have the most name brand. And as I said before or previously in some other podcasts as well as last segment, I'm a little down on Oklahoma this year. They have this kid Rattler coming in at quarterback to replace Hurts. And Rattler is supposed to be the real deal. He's supposed to be a very good quarterback. He was a 5-star recruit. He is going to be stepping into a system under Lincoln Riley where obviously they are never hurting for offensive ingenuity or offensive capability. He also has 2 or 3 very highly recruited wide receivers around him that he's going to be able to play with and see what they can do. But unfortunately, just being a young guy, he does seem to be a little bit of a hothead, which I personally do not have a problem with. I like kids with a chip on their shoulder. I think that's how you're supposed to play. But being young, stepping into a program such as Oklahoma, perhaps if he's in a close game, something goes wrong, the momentum of the game begins to turn against him, I could see that possibly biting him in the butt, needless to say, once or twice, maybe, perhaps. We'll see what happens. I just think there are going to be 1 or 2 games here that Oklahoma loses this year because they have a young quarterback. And it's not necessarily that I blame him. It's not necessarily that I think it's because he's not good enough. Because from everything I hear, he's a very good competitor. He's very accurate with the ball. He's sort of a little undersized, but I don't think that's too big of a deal. But I just get the sense of him that he is very competitive, but the other side of that coin is that you can be a little bit of a hothead sometimes. And in college football, when a lot of things are on the line, sometimes you're able to pull it out, but also sometimes that can work against you and you let your emotions get the better of you. I see that perhaps maybe 1 or 2 games just don't go his way, or perhaps he makes a quote-unquote rookie mistake. Now, he did play last year in some games in cleanup time for Hurts, so it's not like he's completely inexperienced. Again, playing 12 games versus a few snaps is obviously a very big leap in playing time. So let's get into it. First, I start off with a cupcake, the Missouri State Bears, obviously a win. Then the second game of the year, they play the Tennessee Volunteers. And while most people would probably just write off Tennessee and say that Oklahoma is going to win that game, I am not so sure. You're going to be catching Rattler in his first real test as a quarterback, a starting quarterback anyways, for Oklahoma. And Tennessee does have good recruiting classes. They do have good athletes. They tend to have pretty good defenses. While they have been hurting for some quarterback play the last few years, and for the better part of perhaps 5 to 10 years, Tennessee does have good teams across the board typically when you just compare them to your average college football team. Now, I know a lot of people will say that's not true or perhaps don't believe me, but Tennessee on a regular basis has good recruiting classes, they have good athletes, and they typically can muddy the game up or perhaps surprise you a little bit if you take them for granted. They are definitely one of those teams that if you are better than them, you better put them away early and you better put them away often, because if you let them hang around, they will take advantage, they will make it a close game, and they do have the possibility to knock you off if you do not respect them and you do not come in thinking that they are a good team. I see that being a closer game than most people would think. It is in Oklahoma. I give the slight edge to Oklahoma here. Perhaps their offense is able to put together 1 or 2 drives there at the end to kind of pull away. But I do not think they should be writing Tennessee off, and neither should any of the college football world. Again, this is going to be Rattler's first real test as a starting quarterback at Oklahoma, and Tennessee is no scrub. Tennessee is not a walk. Tennessee is not a cupcake team, and they will be coming after him, and they will definitely give him some looks. They will definitely be trying to get some pressure on him, and that could spell some disaster if they're able to perhaps get in his head, something of this nature early on. But you would think that Oklahoma probably wins that game. Then they have a week off, and this is actually one of the things I wanted to talk about with Oklahoma's schedule, is that their bye week is the third week of the season, and I am not a fan of early bye weeks. I hate early bye weeks for a team. I just feel that your bye weeks are better if you can get them later in the year when you might have some injuries. Maybe you have had 2, 3, 4, 5 games to look at your team, see what you're good at, see what your strengths are, see what your weaknesses are. And as a coach, you can use those 2 weeks during your bye week to perhaps tweak some things a little more than you can just on a week-to-week basis, trying to maybe play catch-up as you get ready for your next week's opponent. So I'm not a big fan of the third week bye, and I think that works against Oklahoma in the long run as they go through the remainder of their season with what is essentially a rookie quarterback. Then they play the Army Black Knights. Now, had this been the Army from 2 years ago, I actually may pick Army to win. Unfortunately, they did not have a good year last year, and I don't see them being much better. So I think Oklahoma is going to win this one. Again, Army's just kind of one of those weird teams with the formation that they run on offense. They're definitely a pretty hard-nosed or tough defense. They just lack the athletes to keep up with people. You never know. Army sometimes can sort of keep things close. I don't expect Army to really give Oklahoma much of a problem here. Then they have Baylor. They will be playing Baylor at home in Norman, Oklahoma. And again, I expect Baylor to not be as good. You know, who knows? This is a shootout. Maybe the last man with the ball wins. But I think Oklahoma is able to put Baylor away actually pretty easily. Again, unless Rattler is falling apart or struggling or something like this, you know, I think that they beat Baylor. Then they play Texas October 10th, and I think Texas takes this game. I got Texas winning by 3 to 7 points, something like that, a close game. Maybe 10 points if Ellinger's just able to have a good game and Rattler maybe makes a mistake or two that Texas is able to capitalize on. Again, like I said, I think Texas is going to have a much improved defense next year, mainly just based on the fact that they'll be healthy. Now, again, they could always get hurt or have more injuries again. Nobody can predict the future, but I think Texas is going to have a very stout defense, and I think that they're going to be able to sort of keep Rattler in that offense at bay. And if Ellinger can just kind of continue to be a good, solid college quarterback, I think Texas wins this game. And, of course, this game is always played at a neutral site at the Cotton Bowl down there in Dallas. Then Oklahoma has Iowa State, which should be a win. Then they play Oklahoma State. And Oklahoma State is sort of my dark horse for the Big 12. While I don't think they'll be able to sort of leapfrog Texas or Oklahoma, I do think Oklahoma State, depending on if Gundy can get that offense running, and they have their very great running back in Hubbard, who was a Heisman finalist or was in the Heisman voting, who knows what they're able to do this year coming up. They're always kind of a wild card, in my opinion, in the Big 12. They always are able to sort of manufacture some offense. Their defense, of course, could probably use a little bit of help. This is just a game that, Oklahoma State could very easily win this game depending on if their offense is clicking and depending if Hubbard has a big game, which he's proven he can do time and again. I would like to think that Oklahoma wins this game. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and if Oklahoma State is running the ball well and they can keep it out of the hands of Oklahoma and their offense, then Oklahoma State could very well win this game as well. I definitely think it's close. I don't think Oklahoma by any means is going to run away with this game. I definitely think it's a single-digit victory for whoever wins. And to be honest with you, I really have this game as a toss-up. I'm sitting here right now. I was going to say Oklahoma probably wins. I probably would have to give this one 50-50, 45-55 in Oklahoma's favor, something of this nature. Oklahoma State is not an easy win. They barely lost to A&M by 3 points. Maybe should have beaten A&M depending last year, the last game of the year in their bowl game. But Oklahoma State is always a tough matchup. They are always a tough competitor, especially on the offensive end of the ball. Gundy definitely runs a very good offense. They're going to manufacture some points on you. And if Oklahoma State is going to continue to be more of a running football team, that sometimes is a very good recipe for keeping the ball out of a good offense's hands. I'm honestly going to leave this one sort of undecided. I almost always feel good, or at least I'm able to make a pick. Seeing this is a rivalry game, they always play each other close. I'm just going to give a slight edge to Oklahoma just based on sort of the talent and the athletes that they have. Now, after the Oklahoma State game, Oklahoma has a very nice ending to their year. They play TCU, West Virginia, Kansas State, Kansas, and then Texas Tech. And some of those teams, such as Kansas State and West Virginia and TCU, sort of started out as an okay team last year and then just sort of faltered throughout the year and didn't quite keep it up. Kansas State did have a nice upset against Oklahoma, as well as TCU having a nice upset against Texas. But other than that, none of those teams really were able to manufacture a very good year. Therefore, I see Oklahoma running the table the last 5 games of their football season. So Oklahoma's year will be decided within the first 5 to 7 games of their season, and then I see them getting a nice back end of their schedule. So that was a quick breakdown of Oklahoma's year next year. And when we come back, I'm going to go over the Texas Longhorns and how I see their season playing out as well. So stay tuned, and I'll cover that when we come back.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC College Football Podcast. Last segment, we went over Oklahoma's schedule next year, how I see it playing out, where I think their opportunities lie, and where their obstacles may be. So this segment, we're going to get into the Texas Longhorns. Again, as I've stated, I think Texas wins the Big 12 next year. Looking at their schedule for next year, I feel even more confident about it. To start off the year, they play the University of Southern Florida, the USF Bulls. What's fortunate for Texas in this game is they're catching USF on kind of a downward spiral. USF had some pretty decent teams there for a few years, maybe 4 to 5 years ago, but they really have not been very good as of late. They went 2-6 in their conference last year, 4-8 overall, and they lost their last 4 games coming out of their bye week. So I think they catch USF at the right time. I don't see them really giving Texas any troubles, and neither do I have any doubts that they'll win. Then the big game of the year, or at least one of their big games of the year besides the Oklahoma game, and that is playing LSU. Now, LSU will be losing a lot of talent. They will obviously be losing their best player in Joe Burrows. They'll be losing a lot of players on the defensive and offensive side of the ball that gave them a lot of production. The main thing about this game is they will be playing in Baton Rouge, and I think that will go a long way to helping LSU in terms of the new players who are coming in, and the fact that they will be playing this big game at home, I think helps them. I am not sure what to do here. I think that Texas is going to squeak out a win. I could be completely wrong. LSU could end up blowing them out by 3 touchdowns. I'm not sure. This is a really hard game to call considering that Burrows will be gone next year and they are losing so much talent. Again, if Ed Orgerons is worth all that money that LSU paid him, which I think he is, then LSU will come away with the win because Ed Orgerons will find out a way to coach his new kids up. He will put guys in the right spots to make plays. LSU is obviously never hurting for talent or skill or players who have the ability to get the job done. I'm just wondering, since it is the second game of the year, that Texas will be catching LSU at the right time in terms of them losing so much talent and having to play Texas early on in the 2020 football schedule. And I think everything sort of is working in Texas's favor here, except for the fact that it's in Baton Rouge. And if you don't have the horses to win, then really it doesn't quite matter where you play. I see this being a big defensive battle. I don't see this being a high-scoring game. I think Texas is able to put the clamps on LSU and vice versa. This could be one of those games where one or two big plays, an interception, a pick six, a fumble recovery, a long field goal, just a couple of plays could decide the winner of this game. It could even be one of those 10-13, 10-17, 21-17, something like that. I don't see it being a high-scoring game at all. Typically, when I tell myself that I think it'll come down to one or two big plays, I tend to lean towards the home team and or the team that I think has the better athletes. And in both of those cases, this is LSU. But my gut is just telling me that Texas somehow finds a way to get a win here. If Texas wins this game, it will essentially set them up for the rest of the year in terms of confidence, in terms of ranking, and in terms of many other factors that I think will begin to snowball in their favor. You know, essentially I see their season riding on this game in a way. Now, what Texas has going for it in this game as well is that I've mentioned earlier, sort of in these big early non-conference games, is that if you are the team kind of who has nothing to lose, and I think in this situation Texas has less to lose than LSU does in terms of the rest of their schedule versus who LSU is going to have to play and the mountain that they are going to have to climb versus Texas in the Big 12. As long as Texas does not get blown out and LSU goes on to have a respectable year, you know, maybe LSU loses to Alabama and one other team, then this is okay for Texas. As long as they don't get blown out and embarrassed, then I think they're all right. This is a really hard game to call. This is just a lot like the Oklahoma State game we went over last segment. I'm really not sure who to pick this game. I just think that the seniority of Ehlinger is able to get it done somehow. I think he is the difference in this game. And the fact that the Texas defense will be much better this year. And I think if they could come into this game healthy on defense, I see it being a low-scoring game. And perhaps Ehlinger's able to make one drive to get a field goal or something of this nature to pull away and win the game. So I think at the end of the day, I think this is a pick'em. I think probably when the Vegas line opens up, LSU will probably be a 3-point favorite or something like that. But it will be a close game no matter how you want to dissect it or look at it. And one other thing I like in this game is Tom Herman. I think that perhaps a couple plays of creativity or being able to manufacture some kind of offense that could lead in some extra yards or some extra points could also be the difference. And if I had to pick one of the two coaches who is perhaps a little more creative on the offensive side of the ball, I think that edge definitely goes to Tom Herman. And perhaps a trick play, a counter play, something of this nature where he catches LSU slipping or is able to sort of draw up a good one against them could also be one of those big differences in the game. When I think it is going to be a more low-scoring game, I think both teams will be hurting for any kind of offense that they are able to produce and manufacture. So that's another small advantage that I give to Texas in terms of I think Tom Herman may be able to draw up a play or two at the right moment to sort of drive the knife home into the heart of LSU. You know, if he can call it at the right time and in the right situation, I think Tom Herman has that ability. I think he showed it against Utah as well, the way they were just able to absolutely rout them. And I think Tom Herman is a good offensively minded coach. I think he's very creative. So in a tight position, look for him to perhaps dial something up that could also be the difference. So that was Texas. When we come back, I'm going to touch on Oklahoma State, maybe touch on Baylor as well. I'm not sure if any of the other teams are quite worthy or noticeable enough for me to sort of break them down game by game. I think that perhaps TCU or Kansas State could end up having a decent year compared to last year. But other than that, I'm just not quite sure if there's any other teams besides the ones that are left in terms of Baylor and Oklahoma State that we should maybe touch on. So when we come back, I'll quickly run through Baylor and Oklahoma State, and we'll see how I think their years are going to end up. Stay tuned.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back. Last segment of this hour. We're going to break down or continue to break down the Big 12. Last segment we did Texas. I'm going to pick up where we left off with Oklahoma State for this segment. And one thing that I am liking about Oklahoma State's schedule this coming season is that I think they're going to be able to start 5-0 pretty easy. I actually think they have a pretty decent test in Oregon State for their first game of the year. It will be in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Last year, they absolutely routed Oregon State 52-36. Oregon State did get some points up on them, but when you're able to put 52 on someone else and you win by 16 points, then I think that's a pretty solid win, winning by 2 touchdowns. So I think they win this one, also considering it's at home. I look for them to be able to duplicate that. Then they play the Tulsa Golden Hurricanes. That's a cupcake, easy win. Western Illinois, same thing. They do have an early bye week, which I'm not a big fan of, as I said previously, but it's in the 4th week of the season. Then they play TCU and Iowa State and Kansas. So again, they should be able to start 6-0. Sorry, I apologize. They should be able to start 6-0 pretty easily. Then they play Oklahoma October 24th, and I think this will essentially sort of set the tone for them for the rest of the year. Again, I kind of said earlier that I think this honestly is a toss-up. I think Oklahoma State's best chance to win this game is to run the ball early and often, play the time of possession game, and keep the ball out of the hands of the Oklahoma offense. But since I've already talked about this game, essentially I think they will have to get after Rattler somehow. I think that Oklahoma will be looking to throw the ball a lot next year. Hurts, I think, essentially threw about 24 times a game last year, something around that number. I think they will probably end up throwing it 30-plus times a game next year, especially by the time Oklahoma plays Oklahoma State in the middle of the year. I just have a feeling they are going to air the ball out with Rattler. Now, it's not going to be sort of a high-flying offense. I think it's going to be more of the West Coast, quick passes, quick short passes, throw it to running backs out in the flat, got guys coming across the middle. But I do think that Oklahoma throws the ball a lot, and so I think Oklahoma State will need to be prepared for that. I think that they will have the ability to get some pressure on Rattler. I am not quite sure if his size is going to hold up the whole season. I mentioned that he is a bit of a smaller guy, but I didn't necessarily think it was a big problem. By the time you reach the 7th or 8th game of the year, if you're a smaller guy, sometimes those hits can begin to linger a little bit. They can begin to have an effect. So we'll see how Rattler is doing by the time Oklahoma State rolls around. Again, it's a pick'em. I'm not quite sure how to call this. I give the slight edge to Oklahoma just based on the athletes across the board that they have compared to what Oklahoma State is going to have. If Oklahoma State is going to win this game, Hubbard must have a big game. He must have 150 yards, 2-3 touchdowns. He's got to put up some gaudy numbers. Not so much that they need the production from him, but that they need long, sustainable drives in which he is picking up first downs, they are running out the clock, they are playing the time of possession game, and they are keeping the ball out of the hands of the Oklahoma offense, who may have the ability to score on you in a couple minutes, just depending on if they can get you to make a mistake and they catch you slipping. So I think Oklahoma State, to win that game, is going to have Hubbard be a big and integral part of it. And again, he's already going to be a big part of their offense, but Against Oklahoma, they need those long, sustainable drives where Hubbard is picking up first downs, 3rd and 3s, 3rd and 2s, things like this. And if they're able to do that and the Oklahoma State defense can step up and give some fits to Rattler in that offense, then I can very easily see Oklahoma State winning that game. For Oklahoma State, this will be a big part of it because I see them winning their first 6 games. They play Oklahoma, then they have Texas Tech, a win. Then they play Baylor, which I think will be a win, although it's in Baylor, and the new coach Aranda will definitely be trying to have those boys coached up. But given that Baylor has not recruited very well over the last couple of years, and they are losing some key players on offense, even though their quarterback Brewer is returning, I think Oklahoma State is able to beat Baylor. After Baylor, they have West Virginia, then Kansas State, and then they end their year at home against the Longhorns. And again, I think essentially Oklahoma State's season is going to come down against what they can do against Oklahoma on October 24th, and then how they close their year out November 28th against the Longhorns. They have a good chance here to go 10-2 next year, which would be very respectable and would be a good record. Maybe they lose to Baylor, but I think Oklahoma State is a very good team. I think Hubbard is an amazing player. I think he's probably going to be the best back, or he's going to be fighting with Etienne from Clemson for the best back in the country next year. And since we did Texas last segment in which we sort of broke down the Oklahoma State game as well, again, I think Hubbard is essentially the key to their season, which is not surprising anyone or making any sort of big prediction there. Oklahoma State's defense is going to have to help them out this year. You know, for example, I mentioned they beat Oregon State 52-36. Their defense has got to do a little better. Their offense is more than capable of scoring. But if you look at the games they lost, teams scored 34, 45, 45, and 36. And so their defense has got to do a better job of helping their offense out. I just have a feeling that Texas will probably be able to eke out a win against Oklahoma State. Texas' defense will do everything they can to slow down Hubbard and be semi-successful at it, or at least successful enough to get that win at the end of the year. I really think they could possibly go 10-2. But I think the crux of their season will come down to their defense stepping up and playing some big games rather than losing those big games. And so I think Hubbard is good to go. I think that offense is good to go. Gundy can always manufacture some offense, but that defense is going to have to step up and be the reason they win instead of lose. And I am just not too confident they can do that in some of the bigger games this year. We'll take a quick look at Baylor now. I think Baylor just takes a small step back, which is not saying much considering they had a very good year last year. But I just think with the new coach, they're losing their best wide receiver. I'm just not too confident that they are able to sort of put up the points on offense that they did last year. One thing I have kind of forgot about Baylor, they had a very good defensive front last year and probably didn't get the credit they deserved. If we just take a look at their schedule, I just have a feeling that they are not going to be able to win some of these closer games like we just talked about with Oklahoma State. They play Ole Miss the first game of the year. That is not an easy first game, even though Ole Miss has not been very good the last 2 to 3 to 4 years. Again, just to start your season off with another big school like that, you just never know what could happen. It could go either way. Lane Kiffin's going to obviously be having that offense at Ole Miss probably drastically improved compared to where they were the last few years. The Ole Miss game will be a fun game to watch. I think it'll be interesting to see two new coaches at their respective programs. One is a defensive-minded coach stepping into an offensively dominant team. The other one is an offensively-minded coach stepping into a defensively dominated team. It will be interesting to see who is able to sort of instill their system quicker than the other guy is essentially what this first game will be. Who is able to sort of make what they do be the most present in that game, considering that it's probably each of that team's weakness. I think Baylor probably wins that game in all honesty. I think that they probably squeak out a win against Ole Miss. It'll be at NRG Stadium in Houston, which is a home field advantage for Baylor overall. I think the crowd will probably be pretty evenly split given it's the first game of the year and Ole Miss is not too far from Houston. I mean, it is a bit of a travel, but all things considered, that's pretty close to Mississippi. I think Baylor probably gets that win. Also considering it's inside in a dome probably favors Baylor's offense a little more. Again, I think it's going to be a good game, but I think Baylor is able to eke out that win. Then they play Kansas, which should be a win. Then the Incarnate Word Cardinals, who I don't even know who that team is. I've never heard of them, to be completely honest with you. Louisiana Tech Bulldogs should be a win. Then they play Oklahoma. I think the difference here is that the Oklahoma defense is able to bother the Baylor offense more than the other way around. And so I think Oklahoma wins that game. Then they have a bye week, which I think will help them. They play Texas Tech and TCU next. Those both should be wins as well. Then they play the Longhorns, and because I think the Longhorns will have a better defense next year, I think they win that battle. I think they are able to bother Baylor's offense more than the other way around. Then they play Oklahoma State, which I am expecting to be a barn burner. Then they play Iowa State, West Virginia, and Kansas State. They have an okay schedule. I mean, they have a decently tough first game of the year. Then they play Oklahoma 4 weeks later. Then they play Texas 4 weeks later. And then OSU is right behind them, Oklahoma State back-to-back. And then they play what should be 3 wins to round out their year. Between Oklahoma State, Texas, and Oklahoma, if they can win one of those games, I think that would bode very well for their season. Again, if they can go 10-2 for them, I think it would be a much more impressive 10-2 that Oklahoma State could possibly get. So again, Baylor, I just have a feeling that there will be times that their offense struggles, and I'm just not too confident in their defense to win some of those big games. Much like Oklahoma State, I think they both are kind of the same team in many ways. It's just that Baylor likes to throw the ball and Oklahoma State likes to run the ball. For them to have very good years or extremely good years, their defenses are going to have to win 1 or 2 more games than they lose, and I just don't think their defenses are there yet to make that next jump. That sort of rounds out my overall thoughts on the Big 12. I think there's much less parity than the ACC, which I covered last podcast. I think essentially you have Texas, Oklahoma State, and Oklahoma, and then there's everyone else. Baylor could be surprisingly good next year. Who knows? Maybe they keep it up and they are able to be the second or third best team in the Big 12. But I think you got Texas and Oklahoma jockeying for first and second. Then a close third is Oklahoma State. Close fourth is Baylor, and then there's everyone else. So I think that's kind of how I see it breaking down. I think it'll be interesting to see Texas's defense next year, I think, is the main storyline I'm looking forward to, as well as to see how the Oklahoma offense does. If Lincoln Riley can put together another fantastic year for his offense and in terms of the quarterback specifically, I think it'll really bode well for his legacy, or however you want to frame that in terms of being an offensive coach. Those are the main headlines and how I think it's going to shake down next year in the Big 12. I want to thank all you guys for listening to me again. I really enjoy doing this podcast, and I hope some people are getting some enjoyment and some information out of it, maybe learning a thing or two, or at least bumping up their college football knowledge. I would ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show if you like it, if you like what you're hearing. It always helps us to get our numbers up and get our name out there. If you could also please follow us and give us a like on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I appreciate you guys listening, and I'll talk to you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.